Welcome. Tonight, we travel back to Georgia, 1857, to a plantation house that looked ordinary from the outside, but inside its walls, something waited. A young enslaved boy claimed the walls could speak. Not in dreams, not in madness, but in whispers, real conversations carried through wood and plaster. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And please subscribe, because videos like this take deep research, careful study of historical records, and long hours of uncovering forgotten truths to bring you authentic, powerful stories based on real events. In 1857, plantation architecture in Georgia was designed to project wealth, authority, and permanence. The main house was usually built in a style inspired by Greek Revival design, with tall white columns, wide porches, and symmetrical windows that reflected the ideals of power and control popular in the antebellum South. These homes were often constructed slightly elevated above the ground to protect against humidity and flooding, with brick foundations supporting large wooden frames. From a distance, the plantation house appeared grand and orderly, masking the harsh system that sustained it. The interior layout followed a strict sense of hierarchy. Large central hallways cut through the middle of the house, allowing air to circulate in the humid Georgia heat. On either side were formal parlors, dining rooms, and private studies where business dealings took place. High ceilings and tall windows were not just aesthetic choices. They were functional responses to the southern climate. Thick plaster walls covered wooden lath, and behind those surfaces were hollow cavities that carried both air and, unexpectedly, sound. These houses were built using timber harvested locally, often cut and shaped by enslaved laborers themselves. The craftsmanship could be detailed and precise, but the materials were natural and imperfect. Wood expanded and contracted with the weather. Floorboards creaked. Sound slipped through cracks, vents, and spaces between beams. Conversations held in one room could travel along structural supports and echo faintly into distant corners of the house. Beyond the main house stood additional structures arranged with calculated separation. Kitchens were often detached to reduce fire risk and heat inside the home. Smokehouses, storage sheds, and carriage houses surrounded the central building. Farther away were the slave quarters, small wooden cabins, cramped and poorly insulated, placed deliberately at a distance to reinforce social and physical control. The physical layout of the plantation mirrored the power structure within it. Inside the walls of the main house, construction techniques unintentionally created channels for sound. Plaster was layered over wooden strips, leaving narrow air pockets. Floor joists connected rooms above and below, forming pathways where vibrations could travel. Chimneys and ventilation shafts acted like funnels, carrying whispers upward or across hallways. In a quiet house at night, even low voices could drift through these hidden spaces. Privacy, as plantation owners understood it, was assumed rather than engineered. They believed thick walls and closed doors ensured secrecy. However, architecture of that era did not prioritize soundproofing, the very design that allowed the house to breathe in Georgia's oppressive heat also allowed it to carry fragments of speech. A person standing near a wall, especially in silence, could sometimes catch words not meant for them. In 1857 Georgia, these grand homes symbolized dominance and stability. Yet their construction held unintended vulnerabilities. The plantation house was both a fortress of authority and a fragile wooden structure shaped by climate, labor, and limited technology. Within its beams and hollow spaces, sound could travel quietly, turning the architecture itself into an unwitting witness to the secrets spoken inside. The acoustic properties of hollow plantation walls in 1857, Georgia were not something builders intentionally engineered for sound control. They were simply a byproduct of construction methods common at the time. Most large homes were framed with heavy timber beams and covered with wooden lath strips over which wet plaster was applied. This created narrow cavities between the exterior siding and the interior plaster. Those empty spaces, though small, acted like primitive sound channels, allowing vibrations from voices to travel farther than expected. Sound moves through vibration, and wood is an efficient conductor of those vibrations. When someone spoke in a quiet room, their voice caused slight movements in the air and surrounding surfaces. In a plantation house built primarily from timber, those vibrations could pass through floor joists, wall studs, and ceiling beams. The long wooden supports connecting multiple rooms effectively linked separate spaces together, forming a continuous pathway for sound waves. High ceilings, common in southern homes to combat heat, also influenced acoustics. Tall rooms created echo effects, amplifying certain tones and allowing sound to bounce before fading. When doors were closed but not tightly sealed, as was typical in the mid-19th century, voices could slip through cracks around frames. Even keyholes and ventilation gaps became small acoustic openings. In a silent nighttime environment, whispers that seemed private could carry clearly along these routes. Chimneys and fireplaces further complicated the way sound moved inside plantation houses. Brick chimneys ran vertically through the structure, often connecting multiple fireplaces across floors. These shafts functioned like hollow tubes, unintentionally channeling sound upward or downward. A low conversation in a downstairs study might rise faintly into an upstairs room if the house was still enough to allow it. Ventilation was another factor. Before modern air conditioning, homes relied on airflow for cooling. Transom windows above doors and small vents near ceilings allowed air to circulate. These openings also created pathways for sound, because plantation homes were designed to breathe. In Georgia's humid climate, they could not be tightly sealed. The same airflow that cooled the house also carried fragments of speech across hallways and into distant corners. The time of day significantly affected acoustics. During daylight hours, the noise of movement, work, and outdoor activity masked subtle sounds. But at night, when most of the house settled into silence, even soft speech became more noticeable. As temperatures dropped, wooden beams contracted slightly, sometimes tightening connections and allowing vibrations to travel more cleanly through solid surfaces. In such stillness, the structure itself seemed to magnify hidden voices. Although plantation owners believed thick plaster walls provided privacy, true soundproofing technology did not exist in domestic architecture of that period. The hollow design, wooden framework, and interconnected beams created an environment where conversations could drift in unexpected ways. What seemed like solid barriers were, in reality, layered shells surrounding narrow air pockets, and within those pockets, sound could linger, travel, and reveal what was never overheard. In 1857, Georgia's plantation economy was deeply tied to cotton, a crop that had made the American South enormously profitable in previous decades. Cotton exports fed textile mills in Britain and the northern United States, and plantation owners relied on this steady demand to maintain their wealth. Large estates often operated on credit, borrowing money against future harvests to purchase more land and enslaved laborers. As long as cotton prices remained high and yields were strong, the system appeared stable. However, the national financial panic of 1857 shook that confidence. Banks failed, credit tightened, and global markets fluctuated. Although the southern economy did not collapse as dramatically as some northern industries, the ripple effects were felt across plantation regions. Cotton prices dipped, and access to easy loans became more uncertain. Plantation owners who had expanded aggressively on borrowed money suddenly faced pressure to meet debts without guaranteed returns. Many slaveholders had mortgaged not only their land, but also the people they enslaved. Enslaved individuals were legally treated as property and could be used as collateral for loans. When financial strain increased, selling enslaved workers became a quick way to generate cash. This practice fed the internal slave trade, where individuals were transported from the Upper South to expanding cotton territories farther west and south. For enslaved families, economic downturns often meant separation and forced relocation. The economic crisis heightened anxiety inside plantation households. Masters who once displayed confidence in their prosperity grew cautious and secretive. Conversations about declining profits, overdue payments, and pressure from creditors became more frequent. Decisions that directly affected the lives of enslaved people, including sales, punishments, or increased labor demands, were often driven by financial desperation rather than routine management. At the same time, political tensions were rising nationally. Debates over slavery's expansion into new territories intensified sectional conflict between North and South. While 1857 was still 4 years before the Civil War, uncertainty about the nation's future added another layer of instability. Southern elites defended slavery as both a social system and an economic necessity, arguing that their entire regional wealth depended upon it. For enslaved communities, economic instability translated into fear. Rumors of sales or transfers spread quickly whenever money troubles surfaced. Families understood that financial hardship for the master could mean immediate and irreversible consequences for them. A whispered discussion about debt inside the main house might signal impending auctions or forced migrations, making overheard information incredibly valuable. Thus, the economic crisis before the Civil War was not merely a backdrop, but a driving force that shaped daily life on Georgia plantations. Falling cotton prices, restricted credit, and mounting debts created tension within slaveholding households. Behind closed doors, financial calculations determined by human fates, turning private economic discussions into matters of survival for those whose lives were bound to the plantation system. By 1857, the threat of the internal slave trade hung heavily over enslaved communities in Georgia. The phrase, "sold downriver," carried particular terror. It referred to being sent from the Upper South to the expanding cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South, especially states like Mississippi and Louisiana. Conditions there were often harsher, labor more grueling, and the chances of ever seeing family again almost non-existent. The internal slave trade had become one of the most profitable businesses in the South, moving hundreds of thousands of enslaved people across state lines. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which had been legally banned in the United States in 1808, the domestic trade remained active and legal. Slave traders traveled from plantation to plantation, purchasing individuals and transporting them in chained groups to markets in cities such as New Orleans. Families could be divided in a single afternoon. Husbands separated from wives, children from parents, siblings from each other, all based on financial calculations and labor demands. On Georgia plantations, even rumors of financial trouble could trigger fear of sale. Enslaved people understood that if a master faced mounting debt or declining crop profits, human beings were often the first assets liquidated. Conversations inside the main house about money shortages or upcoming visits from traders were not abstract business discussions. They were signals of possible family destruction. Every whispered plan carried life-altering consequences. Slaveholders sometimes used the threat of sale as a tool of psychological control. Overseers would warn individuals that disobedience, resistance, or perceived laziness could result in being sent down the river. This constant threat created an atmosphere of anxiety designed to enforce compliance. The possibility of permanent separation functioned as punishment even before any physical action was taken. The process of sale was swift and impersonal. Traders inspected enslaved individuals much like livestock, examining physical strength, age, and health. Notices for auctions appeared in newspapers, listing men, women, and children alongside land and tools. Buyers rarely considered family bonds unless it increased market value. Emotional suffering had no place in financial transactions. For enslaved families, preparation often meant quiet resilience. Some tried to maintain hope by memorizing names, birth dates, and places in case reunification ever became possible. Others shared coded information or warnings if they suspected traders were coming. Overheard conversations from inside the plantation house could provide crucial time. Even a few days' notice might allow families to say goodbye or attempt escape. Thus, the internal slave trade threats were not distant possibilities, but immediate realities woven into daily life in 1857 Georgia. Economic pressures, deliberate intimidation, and an active market in human beings ensured that every private discussion among slaveholders carried enormous weight. Within this system, information became a fragile shield against sudden loss, and the mere knowledge of an impending sale could mean the difference between preparation and devastating surprise. Psychological control on plantations in 1857 Georgia was as deliberate and calculated as physical punishment. Slaveholders understood that maintaining dominance over large numbers of enslaved people required more than force alone. They cultivated fear, uncertainty, and dependency to create an environment where resistance felt both dangerous and futile. Control of the mind was often more efficient than control through constant violence. One of the primary tools of psychological control was unpredictability. Enslaved individuals never fully knew when punishment might come or what action might trigger it. Rules could shift without warning. An overseer's mood, a minor mistake, or a rumor of defiance could lead to severe consequences. This instability kept people in a constant state of vigilance, forcing them to carefully measure every word and action. Isolation was another powerful strategy. Plantation layouts physically separated enslaved quarters from the main house, but emotional isolation was reinforced as well. Owners sometimes divided families across different fields or tasks to limit communication. Trusted positions inside the house were granted selectively, creating suspicion among others. By restricting unity and spreading distrust, slaveholders attempted to weaken collective resistance. Information control played a critical role. Enslaved people were often denied access to news about the outside world. Literacy was heavily restricted and, in many places, illegal to teach. By limiting knowledge of political events, abolitionist movements, or even regional changes, slaveholders sought to confine awareness to the plantation itself. Ignorance was used as a barrier to hope and organized defiance. Religious instruction was sometimes manipulated to reinforce obedience. Selected biblical passages emphasizing servitude and submission were taught, while themes of liberation were minimized or discouraged. This selective interpretation aimed to frame slavery as divinely sanctioned, encouraging acceptance of suffering as part of a predetermined order. Spiritual life, which could be a source of strength, was often carefully monitored. Public punishment also served psychological purposes beyond physical pain. Whippings and other brutal acts were frequently carried out in view of others to create collective fear. The spectacle reinforced the consequences of resistance. Even those not directly punished internalized the message. The memory of witnessing violence lingered, shaping behavior long after the immediate event ended. Through unpredictability, isolation, information restriction, manipulated belief systems, and public displays of punishment, plantation systems cultivated an atmosphere of mental confinement. Psychological control ensured that fear extended beyond chains and physical boundaries. It lived in daily anticipation, in silences, and in the knowledge that power could be exercised at any moment, making mental resistance just as dangerous as physical rebellion. Secret communication among enslaved people in 1857 Georgia was essential for survival. Open discussion of plans, fears, or resistance could result in punishment, so information had to move quietly and carefully. Despite strict surveillance, enslaved communities developed subtle ways to share warnings, maintain unity, and protect one another. Communication became both an art and a lifeline within the plantation system. Oral tradition played a powerful role. Stories, songs, and spirituals often carried layered meanings. On the surface, lyrics appeared religious or simple, but certain phrases could signal hope, caution, or direction. A change in tone, rhythm, or repetition sometimes carried messages understood only within the community. Music allowed information to move across fields without appearing suspicious to overseers who underestimated its significance. Body language and coded gestures were equally important. A glance held for a moment too long, a hand signal, or the way tools were placed could communicate silent warnings. Because enslaved workers were often spread across large areas of land, nonverbal cues allowed them to share immediate information without speaking. These small signals built a network of awareness that functioned beneath the notice of those in power. Nighttime gatherings in quarters provided opportunities for more direct communication. After long days of labor, enslaved families and neighbors would gather to talk quietly, share news, and strengthen communal bonds. These conversations often included updates about nearby plantations, rumors of traders, or whispers of possible escape routes. Trust was critical. Revealing information to the wrong person could have devastating consequences. Travel between plantations, though restricted, also facilitated the spread of news. Enslaved individuals assigned to errands, deliveries, or skilled labor sometimes encountered others beyond their immediate plantation. In these brief interactions, information passed quickly about harsh overseers, upcoming sales, or shifting economic conditions. Word traveled through these informal networks faster than slaveholders often realized. Religious meetings, particularly those held secretly in woods or hidden areas, served as another communication hub. These gatherings were spaces where spiritual encouragement blended with practical discussion. Messages about danger, resistance, or hope could be shared under the protection of collective worship. Faith communities provided both emotional strength and strategic coordination. Through songs, gestures, whispered conversations, and trusted networks, enslaved people created systems of communication that operated beneath constant surveillance. These methods were not accidental, but developed from necessity and resilience. In a world where knowledge could mean the difference between separation and survival, secret communication became one of the most powerful forms of quiet resistance. Surveillance and punishment systems on Georgia plantations in 1857 were carefully structured to maintain total control. Plantation owners relied on constant observation to prevent resistance, escape, or organized rebellion. The system functioned through layers of authority, the master at the top, overseers managing daily labor, and sometimes enslaved drivers forced into supervisory roles. This hierarchy ensured that watchful eyes were present from sunrise to nightfall. Overseers played a central role in daily surveillance. They monitored field work, measured productivity, enforced discipline, and reported directly to the plantation owner. Many carried whips or weapons as visible reminders of authority. Their presence was intended not only to correct behavior, but to discourage even the thought of disobedience. Regular patrols across fields and near slave quarters reinforced the sense that privacy did not exist. Night patrols extended this surveillance beyond working hours. In many southern regions, organized patrol groups, sometimes made up of local white citizens, rode through rural areas, checking passes, searching cabins, and questioning any black person found traveling without written permission. These patrols were designed to prevent escape attempts and suppress communication between plantations. The fear of being stopped or punished after dark limited movement and connection. Punishments were swift and varied depending on the perceived offense. Whipping was among the most common forms of discipline, often administered publicly to serve as a warning. Other punishments included shackling, confinement, forced labor under harsher conditions, or deprivation of food and rest. The severity was meant to create a lasting psychological impact, not only on the individual, but on the entire enslaved community. Documentation was also part of the system. Some plantation owners kept detailed records of behavior, productivity, and disciplinary actions. These written logs treated human beings as inventory, noting infractions alongside crop yields and livestock counts. Such records allowed owners to justify punishment as management, disguising cruelty within administrative routine. Informants, whether voluntary or coerced, added another layer to the surveillance structure. Enslaved individuals in slightly privileged positions inside the house or assigned as drivers could be pressured to report on others. This practice sowed distrust within the community. Even the suspicion that someone might repeat a private conversation to the overseer weakened open communication and deepened isolation. Together, surveillance and punishment systems created an atmosphere of constant tension. Observation was not limited to physical presence. It was embedded in daily life through patrols, record keeping, and strategic intimidation. The structure ensured that power extended into fields, cabins, and even moments of rest. Under such conditions, the mere act of listening, speaking, or sharing information carried significant risk, because the system was designed to detect and crush even the smallest signs of resistance. The power of overheard information on a Georgia plantation in 1857 was immense, often carrying consequences far beyond the words themselves. Knowledge of plans, conversations, or intentions could shift the balance between survival and suffering for enslaved people. In a system built on secrecy and control, hearing what was not meant to be heard transformed ordinary individuals into carriers of dangerous, valuable insight. The ability to interpret and act on such information became a subtle form of resistance. Overheard conversations could reveal immediate threats. A whispered discussion between the master and overseer about an upcoming sale or punishment could provide critical hours or even days to prepare. Families could hide belongings, make small attempts at escape, or brace themselves emotionally for forced separation. The stakes were so high that a single overheard sentence might determine whether a person remained in one place or was sent downriver to an unfamiliar and harsher environment. Such information also had strategic significance. Knowledge of the master's economic troubles, debt pressures, or political anxieties could allow enslaved people to anticipate decisions before they were carried out. It allowed them to gauge when the plantation hierarchy was distracted or vulnerable, providing rare opportunities for negotiation, minor subversions, or discreet communication among themselves. The boy who claimed to hear the walls could, in effect, map the hidden currents of power that others assumed were invisible. The psychological effect of overhearing secrets was profound. It created a sense of empowerment, a fleeting control in a system designed to strip autonomy. Knowing something that the master thought private instilled cautious confidence. It also forged a shared understanding. Individuals who listened carefully became central nodes in a network of information, trusted to pass on warnings or subtle guidance to others. This trust strengthened communal bonds and reinforced collective resilience. However, the risk associated with overheard information was extreme. Discovery could result in brutal punishment, immediate sale, or even death. The master's authority relied on the illusion of complete control. When knowledge escaped, it threatened the perception of omnipotence. Enslaved people had to weigh the benefit of acting on information against the danger of being caught. Listening, memorizing, and deciding when or how to act required constant vigilance and judgment. Overheard information also shaped long-term survival strategies. Patterns of speech, schedules of movement, and hidden intentions could be pieced together over time, allowing enslaved individuals to predict actions and adapt accordingly. This accumulation of insight was both practical and protective, helping families avoid direct confrontation, plan small escapes, or conceal valuables. Even partial understanding could mean the difference between suffering and safety. Ultimately, the power of overheard information rested not in formal authority, but in human perception and memory. A whispered secret could ripple through the enslaved community, shifting dynamics silently but decisively. What was meant to remain hidden became a tool for survival, resistance, and subtle empowerment. In a world where freedom was denied, knowledge, even the accidental knowledge carried through walls or whispered voices, became one of the most potent weapons available to those trapped within the plantation system. Fear of rebellion among slaveholders in 1857 Georgia was constant and palpable, shaping nearly every decision they made on their plantations. Even a small act of disobedience or defiance could spark anxiety that spread quickly through the master class. Stories of revolts elsewhere, in Haiti, in urban centers like Charleston, or even rumors of planned uprisings within neighboring plantations, haunted owners and reinforced the notion that enslaved people were always potential threats. This fear justified extreme measures of control, surveillance, and punishment as masters sought to prevent any challenge to their authority before it could arise. The memory of past rebellions lingered in plantation society, keeping owners on edge. Nat Turner's revolt of 1831, though decades earlier, remained a vivid example of how quickly a small group of determined individuals could disrupt an entire region. Word of smaller, local resistances, attempts at running away, subtle sabotage, or communal protests spread among slaveholders and perpetuated paranoia. These historical memories became a lens through which every unexplained incident or whisper was viewed, intensifying suspicion and defensive behavior. Fear of rebellion also shaped daily routines on plantations. Slaveholders instructed overseers to monitor the enslaved constantly, ensuring that no one could gather in numbers without supervision. Work was organized to keep people busy, isolated, and unable to strategize collectively. Even leisure activities were scrutinized, as socializing could quickly become an opportunity for plotting. Masters believed that controlling movement, conversation, and assembly was essential to preventing the spark of insurrection. Punishment and intimidation were used preemptively to suppress any perceived threat. Whippings, confinement, and public reprimands were not only reactions to actual defiance, but warnings to the entire enslaved population. Fear was weaponized, a visible reminder that rebellion would be met with swift and severe consequences. By instilling terror, masters hoped to reduce the likelihood that enslaved people would act collectively against them. Economic pressures amplified these fears. When debts mounted, harvests failed, or rumors of traders circulated, masters worried that desperation could lead to revolt. The enslaved might seize opportunities created by distraction or weakness, and owners understood that financial instability could destabilize their entire operation. This added layer of anxiety meant that surveillance and harsh discipline were not only about control, but also about preserving economic survival. The architecture of fear extended beyond physical punishment. Masters and overseers often spread stories about the consequences of rebellion, emphasizing the futility and danger of resistance. These tales reinforced obedience, ensuring that enslaved people internalized the risks of defiance even before committing any act. Psychological control, combined with visible enforcement, created an environment where rebellion seemed both risky and nearly impossible. Ultimately, fear of rebellion was a defining factor in plantation life. It shaped social hierarchies, work routines, surveillance systems, and interpersonal interactions. For slaveholders, the threat was never abstract. It was real, immediate, and omnipresent. Even walls, floors, and ceilings that carried whispers of secrets could intensify this fear, as masters knew that knowledge was power and that rebellion often began not with weapons, but with information. The symbolism of walls speaking on a Georgia plantation in 1857 carried layers of meaning that went far beyond the literal. To the enslaved boy who claimed to hear them, the walls were more than wooden beams and plaster. They became vessels of hidden truth. Within their hollow spaces, the voices of the master, overseers, and visitors traveled, unintentionally revealing plans, fears, and secrets. The walls symbolized both confinement and revelation, a physical reminder of how knowledge could move silently through structures designed to enforce power. For the enslaved, the walls represented the paradox of their existence. They were trapped within the physical boundaries of the plantation, subjected to labor, punishment, and control. Yet those same walls carried the means to observe the oppressor. Listening to the walls allowed a form of agency, however small, within a system that sought to strip all autonomy. Knowledge transmitted through these structures could be used to anticipate threats, protect families, or share critical warnings, turning passive observation into active resistance. To the masters, the concept of walls speaking was terrifying precisely because it threatened the illusion of absolute control. The architecture that had been intended to shield private conversations became a conduit for the very people they sought to dominate. The idea that the house itself could betray them symbolized the vulnerability inherent in relying solely on intimidation, secrecy, and structural authority. No lock, no thick plaster, no hidden chamber could fully contain the flow of information. On a symbolic level, the walls also reflected the duality of visibility and invisibility. Enslaved people were expected to be seen but silent. Masters were unseen, but believed themselves to be omnipotent. The walls blurred that distinction. They allowed the hidden lives and awareness of the enslaved to intersect with the private world of the powerful, showing that silence could be deceptive and observation could travel in unexpected ways. The phrase, "walls speaking," also evokes the idea that history itself carries voices that were never meant to be heard. In the context of 1857, the walls contained conversations that, if uncovered today, reveal the mechanisms of oppression, the daily realities of survival, and the small acts of resistance that existed within the plantation system. They are symbols of testimony, whispering truths long suppressed by written histories and dominant narratives. For the boy who listened, the walls were not merely passive, they were active participants in the dissemination of knowledge. Every creak, hollow vibration, and subtle echo became part of a communication network. The walls transformed into storytellers, transmitting warnings and secrets, allowing him to navigate danger in ways that the plantation's overseers never anticipated. In this sense, the walls symbolized hidden intelligence, a natural ally in an environment designed to control and obscure. Ultimately, the walls as symbols remind us that power is never absolute. Structures built to dominate can inadvertently empower, silence can conceal, and the environment itself can serve as witness. On the 1857 Georgia plantation, the speaking walls represented both the oppression that confined enslaved people and the subtle, extraordinary ways in which they could reclaim agency. They stand as a testament to resilience, memory, and the enduring truth that even the most rigid systems contain the potential for revelation. Knowledge as resistance on a Georgia plantation in 1857 was a powerful, often understated form of defiance. Enslaved people had almost no legal or physical means to challenge the authority of their masters, but acquiring and sharing information became a subtle yet potent method of asserting agency. Every overheard conversation, observed interaction, or carefully memorized detail offered tools to protect themselves and their families, creating a quiet form of rebellion that could influence outcomes without open confrontation. The ability to interpret information accurately was critical. Enslaved individuals who could read the intentions behind words, gestures, or patterns of behavior were better equipped to anticipate danger. For example, knowing when a master planned to sell a family member, punish someone for a minor infraction, or hide resources allowed individuals to prepare or act preemptively. Each piece of knowledge became a shield and a means of survival, demonstrating that intelligence itself was a weapon in a system designed to suppress all power, but that of the oppressors. Knowledge as resistance also extended to collective strategies. Within quarters and trusted circles, enslaved people shared coded information, warnings, and advice. This network of communication created communal strength and fostered trust among individuals who might otherwise be isolated. In essence, knowledge allowed enslaved communities to form invisible, strategic alliances, making it far harder for masters to control every aspect of their lives. Even mundane details could be leveraged for resistance. The timing of overseer rounds, patterns of work assignments, or the hidden locations of stored goods became critical information. Those who could track and remember these details could avoid punishment, hide resources, or pass along warnings about imminent threats. In this way, everyday observation was not passive. It was a deliberate act of empowerment and quiet defiance. The psychological dimension of knowledge as resistance was profound. Simply being aware of secrets that masters assumed were private offered a sense of control. It challenged the perception of total dominance and reminded enslaved individuals that power was not entirely one-sided. Even the act of listening, remembering, and sharing information within trusted networks undermined the master's authority in ways physical rebellion alone could not achieve. Knowledge also allowed for long-term survival and preparation. Families could anticipate forced sales, plan temporary escapes, or maintain vital connections to distant relatives. The cumulative effect of awareness and communication strengthened resilience across generations. In essence, Information itself became a lifeline, preserving identity, community, and hope under conditions designed to erase them. Ultimately, knowledge as resistance on the plantation illustrates how intellect, observation, and strategic thinking could subvert an oppressive system. While enslaved people were physically constrained and legally powerless, their ability to acquire, interpret, and act on information created spaces of autonomy. In a world built on domination and silence, knowledge became both a shield and a weapon, subtle, yet capable of shaping outcomes in ways that brute force could not achieve. The hidden legacy inside Southern homes in 1857 Georgia extended far beyond their visible architecture. Plantation houses were not merely residences. They were symbols of wealth, power, and control. Yet within their walls, floors, and beams, traces of enslaved people's lives and experiences were often embedded in ways that went unnoticed by the owners. Marks carved into wood, scratches on floorboards, or tally marks hidden inside beams served as private records, silent testimony to events, names, and memories that the dominant society sought to erase. These hidden legacies functioned as both personal and collective memory. Enslaved individuals, denied the ability to write openly or keep official records, sometimes left subtle signs of their presence. In beams, walls, or under floorboards, they might record births, deaths, or important events. These physical traces acted as a quiet assertion of identity, preserving their existence in spaces controlled by those who sought to deny it. They were acts of survival, remembrance, and resistance intertwined. The architecture of the homes themselves often unintentionally preserved these legacies. Hollow walls, attic spaces, and floorboards allowed people to hide belongings, carve secret messages, or observe activity without detection. Even the very layout of the house, designed to control movement and visibility, could be repurposed by the observant or resourceful to document experiences. These hidden marks became a repository of knowledge inaccessible to outsiders and invaluable to those who understood their meaning. Oral history also contributed to this hidden legacy. Stories passed down from generation to generation often referenced places, rooms, or objects within the home. Even if physical traces were destroyed or altered, the memory of what occurred inside the walls persisted. Songs, whispered narratives, and family lore carried knowledge of survival strategies, secret gatherings, and acts of resistance that could guide future generations. In this way, the hidden legacy extended beyond material traces into the social and cultural memory of the community. Some hidden marks may have served practical purposes as well. Enslaved individuals might tally work completed, record payment or debt information, or map out escape routes. These acts of documentation were risky but critical, allowing people to assert some control over their lives and futures despite living under constant surveillance. What appeared as minor scratches or marks to the untrained eye could carry profound meaning and utility within the community. The hidden legacy also reflects the paradox of plantation power. Homes designed to impose authority inadvertently preserved the stories and resistance of those they oppressed. Even as masters sought to control bodies and silence voices, the very structures they built contained evidence of subversion, awareness, and memory. The walls and beams, intended to enforce dominance, became repositories of resilience and testimony. Ultimately, The hidden legacy inside Southern homes is a reminder that history is layered. Beneath grand facades and polished surfaces, traces of human experience persist, carrying stories that challenge dominant narratives. In 1857 Georgia, these silent testimonies, whether carved into wood, remembered in song, or passed through whispered stories, ensured that even in spaces of confinement, the lives, struggles, and agency of enslaved people left an enduring mark that could never be fully erased.